Dr. Ben Gray sat down at his desk in his pack house a few hours later, dropping the sample of Jenna's blood next to him. Tyler had told him that Jenna was a single mom, but Ben had watched Jenna cover the mark on her neck before Tyler came in the room. Some wolf had claimed her at some point, and that caused Ben to have many questions. Why was she single now? And was the baby she was carrying that werewolf's pup? Did Jenna have any idea about werewolves? It was still a bit early to pick up the scent of an unborn werewolf pup, but before long any wolf that came near Jenna would know what she was carrying. His other concern was the fact that Jenna was not a wolf herself. She shouldn't have a problem delivering the pup, but she was going to be extremely tired towards the end of her pregnancy, and the baby would eat more than a normal human baby. Her baby would always be at the top percentile of growth. At least she wasn't having a male pup. That kid would probably eat her out of house and home. Ben himself had been raised outside of the werewolf community by human parents. He'd had no knowledge that he himself was a werewolf until his 16th birthday, when he had unexpectedly shifted. His entire life literally changed overnight. Ben had gone from being the popular high school superstar jock to being practically a nobody. He'd quit football as he'd come to realize this was why he was so much better than everyone else at the sport. He dumped his beautiful cheerleader girlfriend because he was afraid he would hurt her, and he became a recluse. Being in high school was hard enough, but Ben was different. He suddenly had a very big secret, and he knew that if he told anyone he'd sound crazy. He was angry for a long time, angry with everyone because Ben felt as though his life had been ruined. He was mostly angry with his parents for not telling him, but after a bit he realized his anger was unfounded because his parents really had no idea that their only son was a werewolf. He also hated the strange voice that suddenly appeared in his head. The voice claimed to be his wolf, and for a long time Ben blocked the voice out. But after several months of feeling like he was going to jump out of his own skin, the voice finally pushed through and convinced Ben to shift. The hour he spent in the woods that night was one of the most freeing in his life, and suddenly everything felt like it might be okay. Over the next few months, the voice in his head, whom he came to know as his wolf, Blue, became his best friend. Ben had isolated himself so much that he had become very lonely, but now he had someone who he could confide in. Someone who knew his biggest secret. Ben did as much research as he could online about werewolves, but he quickly realized that nothing was definitive proof. He could never confirm anything. He was convinced that he had somehow been changed into a were, though Blue disagreed and insisted that they had been born that way. "I've always been here," Blue told him. Ben disagreed with that, but arguing with his wolf was pointless. Both of them were as stubborn as the day was long. He didn't understand how he could be born to human parents. People weren't just randomly born as werewolves, were they? And Ben was 99 sure his parents were completely human. During his junior year, Ben decided to become a doctor. He knew he was a little late to the ball game, but he had nothing better to do than study. He wanted to learn more about himself and why his body had undergone the strange changes it had. Several years later, while Ben was finishing his residency, his life changed drastically again. His parents were killed in a car accident, and while going through paperwork in his house, he'd found an adoption certificate. It had stunned him. Never once had his parents ever told him he was adopted, but it made him realize Blue really did know what he was talking about. Perhaps Ben had been born this way. After his residency, Ben had taken a job at a small clinic in Pennsylvania. He wanted to be out in the country where he and Blue had freedom to roam, and he wanted time to do research, something working at a big hospital would never afford him. But he wasn't in town long before he unknowingly attracted the attention of the local wolf pack and a certain beautiful she-wolf that Ben couldn't resist. What a Ben couldn't resist, one of Ben's biggest rules since he had discovered he was a werewolf, was no women. He had not had a girlfriend or even a casual fling since his 16th birthday. He knew how strong he was, and he was afraid of hurting someone. But Risa he'd been unable to resist. They'd met in the local grocery store and had barely made it out the door before he'd broken his own rule. A visit from her alpha a few days later had shaken Ben up a bit, but it has also opened up a whole new world for him. Now, 2 years later, Ben was a member of a pack mated to Risa, and both the pack doctor and doctor at the clinic part-time. When Ben had joined, the previous pack doctor had been planning to retire. He took Ben under his wing and taught him as much as he could. Ben's office was full of books, and he spent a great deal of time reading when Risa was travelling for her own job. Ben stood up from his desk and stretched before moving over to a table with a microscope and placing some of Jenna's blood on a few different slides. He spent his time carefully looking at each one. Sure enough, the markers were there. Jenna's baby was half-werewolf. Ben rubbed his eyes. He didn't want her daughter to grow up like he had, completely blindsided when she turned 16 and suddenly shifted into a wolf. What if she wasn't alone like he'd been? That would be very bad. But he had no idea if Jenna had any idea of what she was carrying. And where was the pup's father? Why would he mark her and leave her? Ben sighed as he put the blood sample in the fridge and left his clinic. There wasn't much he could do about it for now. He'd just monitor her care and make sure Jenna gave birth to a healthy pup. In the meantime, he'd discuss the situation with Risa and then perhaps his alpha and decide what to do. Jenna's pup would be a rogue, and while his own pack was non-judgmental, some other packs hated rogues. But there was plenty of time to figure that out later. Ben flipped off the lights in his office and locked up. He headed down the hall to the elevator and took it up to his floor and Risa, eager to spend some time alone with her. "It's been 2 months. What am I paying you for?" Tim Manning jumped as his client's fist came down on his desk hard. Daniel Remington scared the crap out of him. Manning was the third detective Daniel had hired to find Jenna, and so far he too hadn't come through. To say Daniel was frustrated would be an understatement. He was cranky and pissed off more often than not. He didn't sleep well, and Rafe was constantly agitated, driving Daniel insane as he whined for his mate in Daniel's head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Remington, but there's just not much out there I can find." "I've done what I can," the detective said, closing the file on his desk. He had done quite a bit of digging, and he had hit a brick wall. Tim no longer wanted Daniel Remington as a client. "Did you ever consider the possibility that someone doesn't want you to find her?" Daniel stared at him for a moment, then stood. "Good day, Mr. Manning," he said on his way out. Tim breathed a sigh of relief when the large man with the suffocating presence was out of his life. Daniel Remington had been one of the most intimidating men he'd ever dealt with, and he almost felt sorry for Jenna Browning if Remington ever did find her. He watched Daniel get into his car through the window. The car sat there for a moment before finally pulling away from the curb. Tim returned to his desk and picked up his phone, punching in a number he had memorized. "I got rid of the man who is searching for Mrs. Browning." "He's no longer my client," he said into the phone. "Good," the voice on the other end answered. "What was your excuse?" "That I've hit a brick wall and there's nothing more I could find out," Tim answered. "Tell me who your client is. I'll pay you well for the information." "No way. He scares me more than you do. I won't reveal my client." Tim ended the call and sat down at his desk, glad to be out of that mess. Both of the men made him nervous, but there was just something about Remington that made Tim never want to meet the man in a dark alley. Mitch Browning stared at his phone for a moment and sighed. He was alone in his office at home. Worry creased his forehead. Someone was looking for Jenna and had been pretty much since she'd moved back home. So far, they hadn't succeeded in finding her. He'd made sure of that. The moment someone had started prodding into her background, his man in D.C. had let him know. Mitch wondered if it was the father of Jenna's baby. He wasn't happy that the man had left his daughter. He had asked Jenna about it, but she hadn't said much, telling him it had just been a one-night stand. Mitch hadn't liked that answer, but he wouldn't push her. He had seen the pain in her eyes and wondered if Jenna was being honest with him. He'd made the decision to keep the man away from her. Jenna had her family to support her and help her raise this baby. Mitch would make sure she and his granddaughter had everything they would ever need. So far, this unknown person had hired 3 different detectives, but he'd had no luck. Not that Mitch's had been much better. None of the detectives would tell him the man's name. They all seemed afraid of him, which really worried Mitch. Who was this person? What kind of power did he hold? And how did Jenna know him? Now that he was retired, he had all the time in the world. He'd wait and see who the man would hire next. 2 could play at this game of cat and mouse. He hadn't told Jenna any of this, and he didn't plan to unless it was absolutely necessary. She had no phone, no bills, no car, and she'd never switched her license over to Pennsylvania. She was pretty much off the grid. Mitch sighed. He'd keep her that way for as long as possible. Daniel opened the door of his car and slipped in after his meeting with the detective. He slammed the door shut and sat there, trying to calm his wolf down. Rafe wanted to go back inside and tear Tim Manning apart. "Waste of time and money," Rafe muttered in disgust. "Bad detective. We can't just go around killing humans, Rafe," Daniel reminded him. His wolf sat down exasperated. "He didn't find me." "Why pay him when he didn't complete his job?" He still put in the time, Rafe. Daniel pulled out on the road to begin the 2-hour drive back to the pack house. Every day that passed made Daniel more miserable. The only good thing was that Jenna seemed happier over the last few months. The sadness was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been. He also knew Jenna hadn't slept with anyone else. If she did, he'd feel it. He was dreading the moment that happened. Jenna was his. Ours, Rafe reminded him. He'd learned quite a bit about her over the last few months, though most of the information had come from Talia. Jenna's father was a retired Marine Corps general, and his information was heavily protected. He knew the man had retired 2 months after Jenna had left New York, and he knew Jenna was no longer in Virginia, but where she had gone was still a mystery. The easiest information to find out about her was from her time in New York City. He knew she had never contacted Talia again, nor had she gotten another phone, or at least not one in her own name. He'd had his own tech guys keep an eye on that for him. Maybe father is keeping mate hidden, protecting her, Rafe said suddenly. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise at Rafe's comment. Why hadn't he thought of that? Too much going on in your head, Rafe muttered. Ain't that the truth? Daniel responded. He knew he was overthinking the whole thing, but he couldn't help it. Call Talia, Rafe reminded him. Daniel had promised her he'd call her after he left the detective's office this morning and give her an update. Daniel smiled a little as he thought of the she-wolf he'd gotten to know so well over the last 6 months. She was his only connection to Jenna, and she would eagerly talk about her friend to him. Daniel had learned quite a bit about Jenna's personality. Her likes and dislikes and everything made him love her more and more. Hello? Talia sounded tired. Hi, Talia. How are you feeling? She was pregnant with her first pup. She was due in about 3 months, and she was no longer working. Her pregnancy had been a bit rough, and the pregnancy had been a bit rough, and the pack doctor recommended that she not be on her feet as much. I feel like an elephant, she said, sounding a little annoyed. You're more than halfway through, he soothed, trying to be optimistic. Still feels like an eternity, she muttered. Daniel laughed. He liked Talia's quirkiness. Even when he was in a dark mood, she could cheer him up. Tim Manning quit on me. Talia grew quiet for a moment, then sighed. I'm not surprised. What are you going to do now? I don't know. I almost wonder if word is getting back to Jenna's father that someone is looking for her, and he's preventing the information from getting back to me, Daniel said quietly. What makes you think that? Do you think he has that kind of power? Talia questioned. Something the detective said today when I fired him. He was a 3-star general working out of D.C. I'm sure he does, Daniel mused with annoyance. What did the detective say? He said. Did you ever think someone may not want you to find her? Daniel sighed. I may never find her, Talia. What will happen if you don't? I will always remain bonded to her, unable to break it unless one of us. He stopped, not wanting to complete the thought. And if she's ever with someone else? That's awful. Talia was quiet for a moment. Don't give up hope. She was mated to you for a reason. I can't imagine that you'll never see her again. Daniel sighed. I hope you're right, Talia. When are you coming back to New York City? Talia asked him. She ached for him. She couldn't imagine finding James only to lose him again. James was her world. I don't know. Before you give birth. I've been slacking on everything lately, but He sighed again. I don't have the drive to do anything. Fortunately, my dad has been extremely helpful with taking over. Come to the city soon. Get to the city soon. Get away and relax for a bit, Talia said softly. I don't know how to relax any longer. He glanced at his phone when a call beeped through. I gotta go. You take care, Talia. I'll speak to you soon. Bye, Daniel. Tyler headed up the stairs of the house with a smile on his face. He had a surprise for Jenna. He stopped in the doorway of her room and looked inside. Jenna was seated in the rocking chair their father had just recently bought for her in front of the window, her hands resting on her belly as she looked out over the lake. She was 7 months along now, and she looked beautiful, but he could sense the underlying sadness that had been her constant companion since he'd picked her up in New York City. Jenna, she turned to look at him and gave him a smile that never reached her eyes. How was work? Good. I helped deliver a baby today, he said, his critical eye assessing her tired state. I didn't know you delivered babies. She rubbed her hand across her own belly and smiled again. This one came much faster than the mother was expecting, so it was an emergency delivery, but it went well. Tyler walked into her room and sat on her bed. Jenna, would you like to go to Texas with me? What? Her mouth dropped open. When? Why? Tyler laughed at her excitement. I have to go for a seminar. We'd leave Tuesday morning of next week and return Thursday evening, and it's okay that I come. She gripped the arms of the chair, ready to jump up and dance. She'd barely been out of the house since she'd moved back home. I wouldn't have asked if it wasn't. So do you want to go? Of course I do. She stood up and hugged him. A few days away would be welcome, and she'd never been to Texas. Tyler hugged her back. Thrilled, he'd seemed to ease her sadness for a bit. "I'll bring your suitcase up on Monday then, so you can pack." Jenna plopped down on a bench Wednesday morning and sighed. The Texas heat was no joke. She and Tyler had flown in yesterday and gotten settled in their hotel. Today he was in his seminar, and she had the entire day to explore the quaint little town. It was very picturesque. There was only one street with the convention centre on one end and a few hotels on the other. Several small shops, cafes and pastry shops lined either side of the street. Everything matched, from the blue roofs to the hydrangea bushes planted in the yards to the winding stone paths leading up to each matching doorway. Jenna wanted to explore each shop, but she knew, as pregnant as she was, she'd be miserable before she was halfway through. Maybe one day she would get the opportunity to come back. She lifted her feet and looked down at them. They were a little swollen. She'd chosen to wear flip-flops out just in case. She'd sit for a bit, then continue her exploration. She had already been inside 3 shops, including a souvenir shop where she's picked up something for her parents and brothers. Everyone she had met so far had been incredibly nice and welcoming. Though she supposed for a tourist town that was to be expected, Jenna watched people wandering up and down the sidewalks. Some, she noticed, could pass for werewolves, and she wondered if they really were. She spotted 3 men standing across the street in front of the dry cleaner who could easily pass for wolves. All 3 were exceptionally good-looking. They were tall and very ripped, their shirts stretched tightly across their massive chests. They would occasionally speak to each other, but mostly they just watched everyone. All 3 had been watching her, she noticed, though not openly. "Luna, would you like some water?" The question caused Jenna to glance up from her eye candy to see a beautiful young woman with dark hair looking at her. Another wolf. Had she just called her Luna? She must be confused. "I'm Jenna," she smiled up at the woman. The woman flashed her a brilliant smile and bowed her head. "I'm Jules. Would you like a bottled water? I just got them from the shop, and you look like you could use one." She held out a bottle to Jenna. Jenna smiled bigger. "I could definitely use one." She opened her bag. "How much?" "Oh, no charge. I just thought you could use one in this heat," and her gaze flitted down to Jenna's belly, and she held the bottle out. Jenna accepted it from her. "Thank you so much." The woman nodded and continued on down the sidewalk. Jenna glanced back up to the 3 men and saw only one of them was left. He was speaking to a woman with a small child in her arms. He kissed her on the forehead, and Jenna sighed. She was about to have half of that. She wouldn't mind having the rest of it. A companion like Daniel. Jenna cut off that train of thought and tossed the empty water bottle in her bag. She stood up and headed down the sidewalk to the next shop. A few hours later, Jenna had visited most of the shops on one side of the road, and she was growing tired. She glanced at her watch. She was supposed to meet Tyler at the cafe at 6:00 p.m. She had about an hour and a half left before it was time to meet him. Jenna stepped into a maternity shop, deciding it would be her last store before she headed to the cafe. A cool drink and a place to sit for a bit and rest before she met Tyler would be welcome. The nurse in Tyler was going to kill her for overdoing it. The shop was empty of people but full of adorable clothes. Jenna walked slowly through the store, admiring the cute outfits. The place was definitely designed with pregnant women in mind, as there were several comfortable chairs with ottomans in front of them placed strategically around the shop. A green halter-top sundress caught Jenna's attention, and she pulled it off the rack to look at. The dress reminded her of the one she wore the night she met Daniel. What did happen to that dress? She wondered if he still had it in his possession. She sighed. As much as she'd like to buy it, the dress was completely impractical. While it was still hot in Texas in October, it definitely was not in Pennsylvania, and by next summer she'd no longer be pregnant. Jenna put the dress back on the rack. "That dress would look lovely on you," a voice commented, startling her. She whipped around to see an older woman standing there watching her. The woman had dark, curly hair with a bit of grey spattered through it and dark eyes. She bowed her head to Jenna and smiled. Jenna tilted her own head as she stared at the woman. She had noticed people doing that to her all day. It must be a town custom. "My name is Elaine. I didn't mean to startle you," she said. "I'm Jenna, and that's okay. You have a lovely shop." Jenna smiled back at the woman. "Thank you, Elaine." Jenna looked Jenna over. "Would you like to come sit for a few moments?" "I have lemonade, and you can put your feet up." Jenna glanced at her watch. "I would like that if it's no bother. I'm meeting my brother at the cafe at 6:00. "No bother at all. Come with me." Elaine turned around and walked behind the front counter and through a door. Jenna followed her and was surprised to see a living quarters behind the shop. There was a living room and a kitchen off to the left. "You can have a seat on that chair over there." Elaine pointed to an overstuffed, comfy brown chair with an ottoman in front of it. "Take your shoes off if you'd like." Elaine opened the refrigerator and pulled out a pitcher of lemonade before grabbing 2 cups out of the cabinet and pouring drinks for both of them. She walked over and handed one to Jenna, then sat down on the couch close by. Jenna had settled into the chair and sighed with relief at how comfortable it was. She kicked off her flip-flops and plopped her feet on the ottoman. "Thank you for being so kind to me. I think I've overdone it a bit today," she admitted. "Not hard to do when you're somewhere new and there's places to explore. Is this your first pup?" Elaine asked. "Yes. How did you?" Jenna looked at her in surprise. "Know your baby is part wolf. I can smell her." Elaine reached a hand out to touch Jenna's belly, then stopped and glanced up, silently asking for permission. Jenna smiled and nodded. "How far along are you?" Elaine asked as she was rewarded with a strong kick. 28 weeks. I'm due around the new year. She's going to be a special baby. I bet your mate is excited." Elaine withdrew her hand and sat back, looking at Jenna expectantly. "My mate?" Jenna frowned. "Did she assume Jenna had a mate because she was pregnant with a werewolf pup?" Elaine tapped her own neck, and Jenna noticed the bite mark on her collarbone, similar to Jenna's own. "What?" "Mom," a male voice called out loudly from the store, interrupting Jenna's question. "Back here, dear." A young man strode into the room from the store, and Jenna recognized one of the 3 men who'd been watching her. He glanced at her, then did a double-take and bowed his head. "Luna," he said softly. "This is Jenna. This is my son, Caden." Elaine introduced him with a smile. "Nice to meet you." Jenna smiled up at him. Whoever this Luna person was, she must really resemble them. She needed a little rest and a break from the heat. "But I do believe you had to head on down to the cafe if you're meeting your brother at 6. Caden, will you please walk her down there?" Elaine stood up. "Oh, that's not necessary. You've already been too kind," Jenna protested, as she sat the glass of lemonade down on a coaster. "I don't mind one bit." Caden flashed a gorgeous smile at her, then reached a hand to help her up off the chair. He turned to his mother and kissed her cheek. "I'll be back in a bit. It was nice meeting you, Jenna. Take good care of that little pup you're carrying." Elaine gave Jenna a hug. "Thank you for being so kind to me." "It was nice meeting you too," Jenna returned the hug, and then looked at Caden. He opened the door to the store and motioned for her to go ahead of him. "We'll see you soon, Jenna," Elaine called. Jenna glanced back at her and waved, then walked back out to the store. Caden held the door open for her, and Jenna stepped out into the Texas heat. Caden fell into step next to her as she started down the sidewalk to the cafe. "So, what do you think of Texas?" "I love it. Well, except the heat. But I suppose if you live here, you get used to it," she smiled. "The town is so beautiful. What brings you here?" Caden asked. "My brother is attending a seminar." Jenna glanced back and forth between him and the windows of the shops they passed. She hadn't got a chance to explore these ones. Maybe tomorrow. They continued on down the sidewalk in comfortable silence. Jenna wanted to ask him a million questions, but rule number 1 still ran through her mind. Don't acknowledge the fact that you know about werewolves. Caden finally stopped in front of the cafe. I do believe this is your stop. Jenna turned to him. Thank you so much for walking me down here. He bowed his head. It's my pleasure, Luna. We'll see you soon. Jenna gave him a funny look. What makes you say that? If my mother says we'll see you soon, then we will see you soon. I don't know how she knows the things she knows, but she's never wrong. So see you soon. Jenna studied him for a moment and saw nothing but sincerity in his piercing blue gaze. He somewhat reminded her of Daniel. Okay, she conceded. See you soon. See you soon. He opened the door of the cafe for her, and she gave him one last smile before stepping inside. Ragnar Asgrim pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed as he sat back in the passenger seat of the black SUV. He'd been in Texas for the last couple of days, meeting with the Alpha of the Lone Star Pack to discuss a rogue problem. While he didn't have a problem with rogues in general, this group of rogues seemed to be involved in quite a bit of criminal activity. Lone Star had been monitoring them for a few weeks now before alerting Regal Eclipse. Ragnar had come to Texas to learn what they had found. It was worse than what he had originally believed. The rogues were involved in trafficking drugs, guns, and humans. They were building quite an enterprise. The problem would have to be dealt with before the human authorities became too aware of what was going on. Ragnar would return to his pack and present the information so they could decide what to do. You okay, Beta? He glanced up at Eric and smiled. Yep, I'm good. Eric was a gamma in the Lone Star Pack and had been tasked with taking Ragnar back to the airport. Hey, can we stop at the cafe on our way out? Eric smiled. You have time. The plane ain't going to take off without me. All right then, let's go. Lannister Pack was the biggest pack in the United States and had a lot of land. They had their own private airport and a small town with a convention centre that could be rented out by both humans and wolves. They also ran a huge cattle ranch and supplied beef to most of the packs in the States. Eric pulled in behind the cafe and parked. Both men headed inside the back entrance of the cafe and found a small table. A gorgeous blonde she, Wolf, immediately walked up and bowed her head. Welcome. What can I get you both to drink? She asked as she placed menus in front of them. Ragnar glanced her over quietly as she gave him a flirtatious smile. It really was too bad he was flying out this evening. It was also too bad he avoided she. Wolves like the plague. They were much too complicated, power-hungry, and hopeful that he would take them as a chosen mate. Humans are so much more simple. They didn't know what or who he was, and generally were not looking for anything long-term. They were just attracted to his werewolf good looks and the pleasure he could give them. But it was all meaningless anymore to him. All he wanted was his mate, elusive creature that she was. The ringing of the bell above the front entrance, followed by a small intake of breath from Eric, pulled Ragnar from his thoughts. The gamma was looking towards the entrance, and Ragnar followed his gaze. A woman had walked in and was now waiting to be seated, and it seemed she had caught the attention of everyone in the room. She was a tiny little thing with brown ringlets piled up on top of her head, her colourful sundress pulled tightly around her very pregnant belly. The hostess hurried over to her and bowed her head. She then led the woman to a booth, and she sat down, facing Ragnar, a small look of relief crossing her face. "Who's she?" Ragnar asked Eric, completely intrigued. She even had his wolf, Rollo's attention, which was unusual. Rollo was never interested in any of the women Ragnar was interested in. He mostly ignored them or half-dozed in Ragnar's mind. Pointless. The wolf had told him more than once. "I have no idea," Eric muttered quietly as he watched her. "Every wolf she's walked past has bowed to her," Ragnar stated. "Who is she?" he asked Rollo. His wolf was at full attention now. The beautiful woman had him captivated, and he peered out at her. "Let me take over." "Okay, Ragnar, take over." "Okay." Ragnar gave Rollo complete control, and the wolf glanced at the gamma, who was staring at him with his mouth hanging open. "Mind your business," he snapped, releasing a bit of his powerful aura. Rollo looked back at the woman and took a deep breath, leaning forward in his seat. She looked up and their gaze met across the cafe. She smelled interesting, human, but her baby, a she-wolf pup that smelled especially intriguing, almost like... But then another smell caught his attention, and Rollo stood up and headed up the aisle towards her. Ragnar's eyes widened in shock as he watched from his back seat position. Rollo had picked up the one smell he never thought they would ever find. "Mate?" Rollo walked past her and out of the cafe. They stopped. He took a long, deep breath, and a small, frustrated growl rumbled in his chest. "She has come in contact with mate," he told Ragnar. Rollo walked down the sidewalk a bit, stopping every so often to smell the air. Finally, the wolf sighed in frustration and allowed Ragnar his control back. "Her bag smells like mate, but mate is not in this town," Rollo sighed quietly. Ragnar turned back to the cafe. "Should we question her?" He stepped back inside and started towards her. "No, it's not the right time." Rollo sat down dejectedly. "What? What do you mean it's not the right time? This is the first lead we've ever had in finding our mate." Ragnar slowed his steps down as he passed the woman by, his gaze sweeping over her and then to the large bag next to her. He took in a deep breath, committing the scent of his mate to memory. "We will meet mate soon, but not until it's time. She probably doesn't even know who mate is." "She doesn't smell of pack," Rollo said. Ragnar sighed himself and sat back down at his table. Their drinks had been dropped off while he'd been outside, and Eric was staring intently into his own, not looking up. "Rollo, did you command him?" "Maybe," his wolf said sheepishly. Ragnar internally rolled his eyes at his wolf. "Gamma," he said sharply. Eric's gaze snapped up to him. "Are you gentlemen ready to order?" The she-wolf was back, but Ragnar found that he'd lost all interest in her. She still smiled flirtatiously at him, but he ignored her. He kept taking deep breaths, searching for the scent of his mate. A man had now joined the mysterious woman at the table, though Ragnar could only see his back. From his scent he gathered that the man was related to her. He sighed internally and diverted his attention to the appetizers that were placed before him. "Soon," Rollo reminded him. Jenna had been well aware of the attention she was getting in the cafe, though she still had no idea why. She'd been aware of the blonde man across the cafe staring so intently at her, and had seen his eyes flash blue as he looked at her. He was quite gorgeous with his full beard and piercing blue eyes. His T-shirt stretched tightly across his bulging arms, leaving no doubt he was a wolf. She watched him get up and walk towards her, and wondered if he was going to join her, but he passed her by and went outside, leaving her a little confused. She felt a little drawn to him, thought not the way she had been drawn to Daniel, probably because, like Daniel, he's a werewolf. After several moments he came back in and returned to his table. He glanced at her again, before diverting his attention to the server who had approached their table. Tyler suddenly sat down across from her, surprising her. She'd been too focused on the handsome blonde wolf. "Hey, have you been waiting long?" Tyler asked with a smile. "No, maybe 10 minutes or so," Jenna returned his smile. Tyler looked tired but excited. "How's the seminar? Great? I've learned quite a bit already." "Jenna, you look worn out. Did you overdo it today?" Tyler asked with concern. "Hi, welcome. Can I get you something to drink, sir?" The server approached their table after she had left with their orders. Tyler turned his attention back to his sister. "Jenna!" "No, well, maybe I overdid it a little. Right now, I just want to eat, then go back to our hotel room, take a cool shower and sleep," she sighed, sipping on her milkshake. "Maybe you should stay at the hotel room tomorrow while I'm at the seminar," Tyler suggested. "I might. Depends on how I feel. There are some other shops I'd like to visit, but I may be too tired," Jenna conceded and stifled a yawn. "Tomorrow, the seminar ends at 1, and our flight leaves at 4, so keep that in mind," Tyler said. Jenna nodded as the server brought over a milkshake for Tyler, promising their food would be out soon. Perhaps she would take his advice. A few hours later, Jenny was back in her hotel room. Tyler had rented one room with 2 full-size beds, which was perfectly fine with her. He'd come back, flipped the ache all the way down, and told her to take a shower first. She now stood in the bathroom staring at her naked body in the mirror. Thoughts of the last time she'd been in a hotel room crossed her mind, and she closed her eyes, running her hands up her body. "You're mine, Jenna, always." Her eyes snapped open, and she sighed as she looked at herself in the mirror again. How much her body had changed since that night. She was no longer the petite little thing she used to be. Now, besides her big belly, her hips were much wider and her breasts much larger. Would Daniel find her beautiful, or would he be disgusted with her? She scoffed and sighed. It didn't matter. The chances of her ever seeing him again were slim to none. She had her baby to focus on now. Daniel was just a happy memory. Jenna slipped into the shower and flipped it on cool, eager to wash off her tacky skin. She needed to forget about him. She had her own family to focus on. November came in with colder temperatures and the scent of snow in the air. Jenna was constantly exhausted. She found herself napping 2 or 3 times a day anymore, and when she'd expressed concern to Dr. Gray, he had said what she was experiencing was normal. She needed to rest as much as possible. The only thing she could think of was the fact that her baby was half werewolf. She really didn't know, but Dr. Ben didn't seem the least bit worried. She sat on the couch now with a notepad, working on a menu and grocery list for Thanksgiving, which was just a few days away. Not that she'd even dream of going to the store herself. That would wear her out completely. Her father and brothers, along with some help from her mother, would make dinner. Jonah would come home on leave, and Michael had talked their father into a deep fryer for the turkey that was currently thawing in the fridge. Jenna glanced up at the time. Tyler and Caroline would be back soon. He'd taken her in for some scans at the hospital in the city to make sure she was still cancer-free. Jenna had wanted to go along but had decided it was best if she didn't, since they were going to be gone most of the day. They were going to do a bit of Christmas shopping beforehand. Jenna looked up from her notebook when Caroline walked into the house. She headed down the hall, slamming the door to her bedroom. Jenna watched her brother walk in a moment later. "What happened?" "Her cancer is back," Tyler said quietly, sitting down in one of the chairs. He rubbed his hand over his face and sighed. Jenna stared at her brother in shock. "Okay, we'll get her through this. Same as before. We can do it," she said, trying to be optimistic. "Jenna," her brother said, stopping her. "Mum is refusing treatment." "No. What?" She dropped the notebook in her lap. "Why?" She said she doesn't want to go through it all again. "You saw what the chemo did to her. Tyler couldn't meet her eyes." Jenna swallowed hard. She really couldn't blame her mother. Having her body pumped full of poison week after week, making her sicker and sicker, had been torture for Jenna. She couldn't imagine how it had been for her mother. "How long does she have?" she whispered. Tyler shrugged. "A few months, maybe." Jenna got up off the couch and headed up to her room. She closed the door behind her, then sat down on the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought Caroline would be there for her, to show her how to be a mother to her own little one. She sighed as she brushed the tears away. She really couldn't blame her. She was angry that the cancer was destroying their family. She placed her hands over her belly. "Hopefully you'll get to meet her, and one day I'll tell you all about what a wonderful, strong woman she was." The smell of fried bacon, eggs and sausage woke Jenna on Christmas Eve morning from a deep slumber. She didn't sleep for very long anymore, and was constantly tired. At 38 weeks, getting comfortable was not much of an option, though Tyler had bought her a pregnancy body pillow, and it made quite a difference. She took a deep breath and rolled onto her back, feeling nostalgic. The best Christmas mornings were the ones when her father was home and not on a deployment. But her mother had always worked very hard to make the Christmases when her father wasn't home as special as she could. Jenna realized that this very well might be her mother's last Christmas. She brushed a lone tear off of her cheek and slowly began to get up. As much as she'd like to just lay there for a while longer, her bladder and the smell of bacon wouldn't let her. She slipped her feet in her pink slippers and stood slowly, frowning at the ache in her back. Jenna had things to do today, and she needed to pace herself if she intended to get them all done. The house had already been decorated weeks ago, and Tyler had been doing most of the gift wrapping. Her mother had gone all out, spoiling her children, husband and her unborn grandchild. Packages had been delivered to the house almost daily, multiple times a day for the last few months, and Jenna had been in charge of keeping the basket of snacks and drinks for their delivery people well stocked. She grabbed her bathrobe and slipped it on before heading for the bathroom. She was the only one on the second floor that had her own private bathroom, and was thankful her brothers had chosen this room for her when they moved in. It was the biggest one on the second level, and gave her plenty of room for the baby furniture that had been slowly added over the last several weeks. Jonah had come home a few days ago on leave for the holidays, and had brought the most adorable basient for her. He'd set it up yesterday, and it was now ready for his little niece. Once she was finished in the bathroom, she walked back out and glanced at the small pile of wrapped gifts she had sitting in a corner. She'd have to enlist the help of one of her brothers to help her bring them down later. She gasped when a contraction hit her and stopped, waiting for it to pass. She'd been getting them on and off for the past few weeks. Her back was aching worse as well. She breathed a little better as the contraction passed, placing her hand over her belly. "I have too much to do today for you to be acting up." Jenna would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous about delivering this baby. Part of her was beyond ready to give birth. She was tired of being so uncomfortable. But the other part of her was very nervous. She really wished she could talk to Talia, or even Elaine. She now regretted that she had gotten the woman's number, but the thought had never even crossed her mind when she's been in Texas. A knock on her bedroom door startled her, and she walked over and opened it, surprised to see Jonah on the other side. "Hey, sis, breakfast is ready." His gaze travelled over her with concern. You okay?" Jenna gave him a brief smile and nodded. "I'm all right. Can you carry some of those packages down for me?" Jonah glanced over at the pile and immediately grabbed a few. "Yup, I'll get them all down there this morning after breakfast. I can carry some," Jenna said, trying to grab one out of Jonah's hand. He held it up over her head. "I've got it, Jenna. Can't have you falling down the steps. Tyler would have my head." Jenna rolled her eyes and followed her brother out of her room. Tyler had become overbearing the last few weeks, and Jenna had resisted the urge to throat punch him more than once. She felt sorry for his poor future pregnant wife. "Dad already has orders ready. He's planning to give out over breakfast," Jonah said as he headed down the steps. "Wouldn't expect any less," Jenna giggled. She stopped as she looked down at the table. Michael and her mother were both seated, her father pouring Caroline a cup of coffee. Tyler brought over a fresh plate of biscuits. "Morning, Jenna. How are you feeling?" he asked, pulling her chair out. Jenna sat down, reminding herself not to cry. "This Christmas was going to be bittersweet. I feel all right. Any more contractions?" She rolled her eyes internally. "I had one this morning," she admitted begrudgingly. Caroline reached over and squeezed her hand, and Jenna smiled at her. Between herself and Caroline, Tyler was in his medical glory. "I'm all right, Tyler. Just starving," she glared at him pointedly, and he sat down, smiling sheepishly. Jonah joined them as soon as he finished rearranging the packages under the tree, discreetly shaking a few that didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the family. Bowls began to be handed around the table as each family member fixed their plate and carried on conversation. Jenna smiled happily as Caroline handed her a bowl of southern gravy. She'd missed meals like this when she lived in New York. She wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. As everyone finished up their breakfast, Mitch suddenly tapped his coffee cup with his knife, and the table quieted down, all eyes on him. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket, and his readers off the top of his head, placing them back over his nose. "Okay, listen up. Tyler, I want you to go over dinner for tomorrow and make sure we have everything we need. Make a list and check it twice. Jenna, same for you and the pies you're planning to bake today. I would like the list of any missing ingredients by 1100 hours. Michael and I will depart to town to recover anything we still need. Jonah, you will help Jenna get the rest of the gifts under the tree. And by help, I mean you will do all of the work. This will be a difficult mission as there is not much room left for gifts." Mitch glanced over the top of his readers at his middle son. "Sir, yes, sir." Jonah sat up straighter in his chair. "I believe I can make it work, sir." "Good. While we are on our mission, Tyler will be on Cape duty. Your job will be to serve lunch and then prep the area for tomorrow. Michael, you will be ordering and picking up pizza around 1600 hours. You will also help out as needed. Jenna and Caroline, you will be supervising this. Morning's activities from the comfort of the living room. You will both be sure to get in a nap today, preferably after lunch." Mitch stopped and looked at the two most important women in his life. He softened his tone. "I just want you both well rested for tomorrow and not to overdo it for today." He squeezed Caroline's hand. "I, for one, am not going to complain about a nap later," Jenna muttered, then grimaced as another contraction hit her. The whole table looked at her, and she felt a hand grab each of hers. She held them tightly until the contraction passed, then breathed out. "Okay, continue." Mitch studied her for a moment. "Jenna, you can start your pies after you eat dinner, though if you would like, I will help you make them." She looked at him in surprise and nodded. "Okay. Christmas music will be played throughout the day. Caroline, you're in charge of that, along with hot cocoa, and then we will start Christmas movies around 1600 hours with the pizza. Jonah, I expect you to keep a fire going in the fireplace." Mitch paused and looked around at his family. "You all have your orders." "Dismissed." Everyone got up from the table, though Jenna remained seated, planning out her day. Her father's orders just followed what their traditional Christmas had always been, and it warmed her heart. He had just placed most of the responsibility on her brothers instead of her and her mother. She would make sure she had everything she needed for her pies, give the list of missing ingredients to Tyler, then go upstairs to take a shower. After, she'd come back down and relax on the couch for a bit. She would need a nap too. While her mind rebelled against the idea, her body wholeheartedly agreed. Plus, she had a busy afternoon and evening planned. She had pies to bake, and she wanted to make candy for her father after he went to bed. It was one of her gifts to him. Tyler picked up her empty plate and sat the family cookbook down in front of her. "Find your pie recipes and read off the ingredients to me," he said. "I'll make sure we have everything for you." Jenna gave him a grateful smile. "Thanks, Tyler." She began flipping through the pages, looking for the pies she wanted to make. "Are you going to accept Dad's help?" Tyler asked as he loaded the dishwasher. Soft strands of Christmas music began to fill the house. "Probably," she admitted, stopping at her first recipe for Dutch apple pie. "Okay, I know I sound like a broken record, but please don't overdo it. I have a feeling Little Miss is going to be making an appearance quite soon." He closed the dishwasher door and flipped it on, then came over to wipe off the table. "I hope so," Jenna groaned. "But I'll be all right. I don't really have the energy to overdo it." Tyler dried off the table, grabbed a notepad and sat down across from her. "Let's work on your list so you can go take a shower." "Are you calling me stinky?" she teased. He laughed and grabbed his nose. "Maybe." A few hours later, Jenna lay in bed wrapped around her body pillow. Her lower back was mildly aching and she'd had 4 more contractions. They were growing more intense. "You're not going to wait much longer, are you?" Her baby had been pretty quiet today, not kicking Jenna's insides black and blue. The house was quiet, as Len had gone out to let the women rest. Jenna laid there for a moment more, then got back up. She grabbed the body pillow and headed downstairs and knocked on her mother's door. "Come in." Jenna pushed the door open and saw her mother laying on the bed, a warm, soft blanket covering her. "Mama, can I lay with you?" "Of course, though you should have asked me to come up to you," she said, sitting up. "Don't get up." Jenna laid the body pillow down, then crawled up on the bed and settled around it as comfortably as she could. Her mother stretched the blanket over her, and they both lay quietly staring at each other for a moment. Caroline placed her hand on Jenna's belly. "She's been very quiet today," Jenna said softly. Caroline gently moved her hands around her big belly, carefully prodding. "It won't be much longer now. Next few days. Have you decided on a name yet?" "No, and I probably won't until she's born." I've been so indecisive. Jenna had it narrowed down to a few different names. She'd already picked Caroline for the middle name, though she hadn't told her mother that. "I'm scared, Mama," she whispered. "Oh, Jenna, I remember how scared I was before Tyler was born. It'll be fine. You're going to be a great mother," her own mother reassured her, placing her hand on Jenna's cheek. "What if I mess up?" "Then you mess up. You chalk it up as experience and move on. And remember, you don't have to do it all yourself. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You've got family that will do anything for you, and this little one is going to have your father and brothers wrapped around her little finger." Caroline brushed Jenna's hair back from her face. "Thanks, Mama. I need the reassurance." She placed her hand on top of her mother's. "Always, Jenna. Now I'm going to shut up so you can get some sleep. You have pies to make later, and I've got entertainment to watch over." Caroline rolled her eyes. As much as she'd like to help more, she just wasn't able to. She knew her time was short. She just wanted to be around long enough to see the first few months of her first grandchild's life. Unfortunately, it would be the only grandchild she'd get to see before she was gone, and she intended to hold that baby as much as she could. Jenna's breathing evened out, and Caroline brushed a tear away as she watched her only daughter sleep. Being a single mother wasn't going to be easy, and she truly hoped Jenna would find someone one day who would be both good to Jenna would find someone one day who would be both good to Jenna and her daughter. She knew Jenna still missed the man that had impregnated her. Whoever he was, he had definitely kept Jenna's heart, and she hoped one day Jenna could find someone who she could love just as deeply. Jenna never spoke of him, but Caroline could see it in her eyes, the longing for someone she couldn't have. Caroline sighed softly. At least Jenna had her family. She'd be sure to speak to each of her boys before she was gone and remind them to take good care of their sister. A few hours later, Jenna slipped back downstairs after her evening nap. She hadn't really slept very well, as the contractions had grown in intensity and gotten closer together. Not that she had told anyone. She wasn't ready for this baby to come yet. What if something went wrong? Jenna rubbed her lower back as she inspected the pies. Her father had done most of the work, and he'd done a fine job. They looked delicious. She needed to cover them and then make his candy. Mitch and Caroline had gone to bed while Jenna had been napping. Tyler was watching TV in his room, and Jonah was wrapping a few last-minute gifts. Jenna wasn't even sure where Michael had disappeared to, probably out with his girlfriend. She set about pulling the ingredients out, and everything she would need, then set to work. Jenna had made the peanut butter pinwheels many times before, and could probably make it in her sleep. She sighed as she finished the candy and began to clean up her mess. Her back was aching badly, and contractions were starting to come more frequently. She ignored them as best she could until she suddenly felt something wet down between her legs. She looked down, and it quickly dawned on her what had just happened. "Crap!" she muttered. She bit her lip as she stared at the mess. She couldn't leave it. She grabbed the paper towels and dropped them on the floor and used her feet to mop up her mess. Jenna groaned as another contraction hit her. She forced herself to breathe through it. She found a mop and started to fill a bucket with water. Another contraction slammed into her, and she whimpered, putting her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. "Jenna?" Jonah called as he came down the stairs. "Oh, what happened?" He stopped at the far end of the kitchen and stared at the floor. Jenna looked up at him and sighed. She couldn't do this. She walked across the floor and handed him the mop. "I'm sorry. My water broke. I need to go." She headed upstairs as quickly as she could. Maybe a warm shower would help. Jonah stared at the floor in shock for a full moment before he dropped the mop and sprinted up the stairs to Tyler's room. "Hey, where's the fire?" Tyler joked as he saw Jonah standing in his doorway, looking like he saw a ghost. "Jenna's water broke," Jonah Whisper shouted at him. "Tyler, jump her up off his bed." "Where is she?" she said. She needed to go and came up to her room. Jonah stepped out of Tyler's way as his brother pushed past him and down the hall to Jenna's room. He knocked, then pushed the door open. Tyler entered her room and looked around. The bathroom door was closed and the shower was running. Their sister's cry of pain had them both hurrying over to the door. Tyler knocked on the door. "Okay, I'm almost done," she called. The water turned off. "How close are your contractions?" Tyler called through the door. "What's going on?" Both men turned to see Mitch standing in the doorway. The running around upstairs had woken him up. Jenna groaned loudly through the door, a shrill scream ripping from her lips. "Too close!" she shrieked. She pulled the door open. "We need to time your contractions," Tyler told her, trying to remain calm. Jenna glared at him. "I need to lie down. This baby is coming. Now?" The ringing phone pulled Ben Gray out of a deep sleep and he groaned as he rolled over and away from Risa's warm body. Who the heck was calling at this hour? He glanced at the number. Tyler, Jenna must be in labour. Tyler, he said, answering the phone. Ben glanced at Risa, who was still sleeping. Is Jenna in labour? It's happening really fast. We don't have time to make it to the clinic, Tyler said, his voice edging on panic. Tyler, calm down. You have to stay calm for Jenna. You know what to do. You've done this before. I'll be right there. What's your address? Ben asked, keeping his own voice calm. Tyler rattled off the address. Okay, I'll be there soon, Ben said, and ended the call. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. Where are you going? His mate Risa asked sleepily. I have to go deliver a baby. You remember me telling you that someone in town is having a baby that's half werewolf? Ben tossed on a pair of old sweats and a T-shirt. He had a feeling this baby would be born before he got there. Mum, she murmured, rolling onto her back. Well, she's in labour. Ben headed into the bathroom. He exited a moment later and was surprised that Risa was now standing beside the bed, stretching her arms. His gaze flickered appreciatively over her naked body as images from the night before ran through his mind. I'm going with you, she stated, grabbing a bra. He nodded. I nodded. I need to run down to my clinic and grab some stuff first. Meet me down there when you're ready 10 minutes later. They were in the SUV flying down the drive to leave the packed territory. Does she know her baby is half werewolf? Risa asked with a yawn. I don't know, Ben said, his eyes scanning the sides of the road, watching for deer. He'd never found the opportunity to talk to Jenna about it, though he knew he still had time. You think she should know? Risa asked. Yes. I know what I went through when I changed. I was so scared, and no one was there for me, Ben reflected, then smiled at his mate when she pulled his hand in hers and squeezed it. Of course, I would speak to Alpha first, but I think I want to wait a bit. Tyler and Jenna's mother is dying of cancer. Risa looked at him and frowned. Oh, that's sad. Ben nodded. She had it before, and it just came back. She doesn't want to go through the treatment anymore. Risa looked at him in surprise. Why not? Chemo is hard on you, especially the type Caroline would need. She has a very aggressive type of cancer, and it may not even work, Ben said softly. Even if the cancer didn't kill her, the chemo might. Risa leaned her head back against the seat, staring out the window, her heart breaking for these people she had yet to meet. Tyler sat in the middle of the bed, counting down the seconds till Dr. Gray got there. Delivering Jenna's baby was the last thing he wanted to do. He was annoyed with her for not telling him she was in labour. He could have gotten her to the clinic and under Dr. Ben's direct supervision. He could already see the baby's head crowning and knew it wouldn't be much longer until he would be holding his niece in his arms. Tyler had delivered babies before, but this was different. He was home surrounded by people he knew and loved. What if something went wrong? Jenna's labour had happened fast. He hoped Dr. Gray got there soon. He looked at his sister, who was sweating profusely and had tears streaming down her cheeks. His father had brought his mother up. She had been woken by Jenna's screams and insisted Mitch bring her to Jenna so she could be present for the birth of her first grandchild and to support her daughter. She sat on Jenna's right, holding her hand. Mitch was pacing the hallway. I need to push, Jenna yelled, her face contorted in pain. Not yet, Tyler said. Why not? She screamed. Tyler glanced up as Dr. Gray hurried in along with a beautiful blonde woman. He breathed a sigh of relief and got out of Dr. Gray's way. Okay, Jenna, next contraction we're going to push, the doctor said, putting on some gloves from his back. A few minutes later, the sounds of a baby's cries filled the room. Tyler, along with the blonde woman, cleaned the crying baby and weighed her. Then he wrapped her up and gave her to Jenna. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she cuddled the newborn, surrounded by her loved ones, the pain and misery of the last hour forgotten. Love warmed her as she stared at her little one, her heart full. Everyone stood around for several long moments before Risa finally spoke up. Everyone out. We need to get Jenna in a clean bed for some much-needed sleep. You can all visit with her and the new baby in the morning. Ben smiled at his mate. Leave it to Risa to take charge. The brothers all filed out. Mitch moved over to Caroline, but she waved him away. I'm going to stay up here and help, she said. He nodded and kissed her forehead, his gaze lingering on the newest member of the family. Jenna, have you picked a name yet? Jenna looked down at the tiny baby, her pup, she thought ruefully. Is it after midnight yet? It's 1:30 in the morning, Risa said, glancing at her watch. Christmas morning. What a Christmas gift, Jenna murmured, gently stroking the baby's cheek. "Her name is Noelle Caroline Browning." Christmas Eve, regal Eclipse Pack House. Daniel had barely left his room that day. It was Christmas Eve, and he had no desire to spend any time with his family or his pack. Jenna had seemed on edge all day, and that kept him on edge. The longer they were apart, the less he felt her emotions. The sadness had returned about a month ago, but today had probably been the worst. "We still feel her. You have just grown accustomed to her emotions." "I monitor them while you are doing human things," Rafe said, sitting proudly, his tail swishing back and forth slowly like a cat. "So the bond is still strong?" Daniel asked, with a bit of relief. Rafe scoffed. "Of course, especially since Mate is close by." "Wait, what did you just say?" Daniel stopped his pacing, paying very close attention to his wolf. "Mate is close by," Rafe repeatedly smugly. "How close?" Daniel growled. "How long had Rafe known she was close?" "Probably within 100 miles or so. She always has been." Rafe shrugged and stood, stretching nonchalantly, as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb on Daniel, shocking the alpha into silence. "Rafe, why did you never tell me this?" Daniel asked after a few moments. He was hurt. Jenna belonged to both of them, and this could have definitely aided in his search. "I wasn't sure until recently. Then I thought back over the last several months, and how when we are here, I feel her very strongly. When we leave, I don't feel her emotions as strong. Usually we are busy with business, and I don't pay as much attention, though I am always monitoring Mate's emotions in the background. I did not want to get both of our hopes up for no reason. But now I am sure," Rafe said confidently. Daniel sat down on the bed and rubbed at his face. "So this entire time she's been right here in Pennsylvania." The day passed slowly for Daniel, with Jenna seeming to grow more and more agitated, which in turn led to Daniel becoming more and more agitated. He'd blocked his family out from mind linking him, and had remained in his apartment, avoiding everyone. He spent most of the day pacing the floor of his bedroom on edge. In all of his years on the face of the earth, Daniel had never felt so helpless as he did right then. Occasionally, Jenna would completely relax for about an hour or so, which put Daniel more on edge. "Mate is sleeping," Rafe explained. Late that night her agitation became overwhelming, with panic occasionally seeping in. "Rafe, what is going on?" Daniel practically shouted at his wolf. "Mate is in pain." Rafe had been pacing too most of the day. Daniel felt waves of her emotions roll over him, fear and panic being the two biggest ones. He flung open the doors to his balcony and walked out into the cool night, gripping the railing and staring out into the woods. He was sweating profusely, his own emotions swirling around as tears streamed down his cheeks. What's happening to her? Did someone have her? Did someone have her? Were they torturing her? Did someone know she was his mate? Only a handful of people even knew about Jenna. "Let me take over, Daniel. I can bear most of the emotion," Rafe said suddenly. "We can run for a bit." Daniel didn't answer, but gave immediate control to Rafe. The wolf jumped off the balcony, shifting in midair and shredding Daniel's clothes. He ran deep into the woods as hard as he could as they were both hit by wave after wave after wave of Jenna's emotions. All of a sudden they stopped, and Rafe came to a halt as well, as they both stood there thinking the worst. But then the most powerful emotion of the night hit them. Love! Rafe immediately gave control back to Daniel, and he shifted back, standing there in the light of a full moon, reveling in the feel of Jenna's love and happiness. Time passed, but Daniel never moved until he finally felt Jenna completely relax, and he knew she was asleep. He shifted back into his wolf, allowing Rafe to take control again to get them home. They were both completely mentally exhausted now, and Daniel wanted to get a few hours of sleep if he could. He was still worried about Jenna's safety, but the overwhelming love that had hit him earlier let him know she was okay. He'd never experienced such a strong emotion from her since he'd marked her, but he knew, somehow, that she was all right. They arrived back at the pack house, and Daniel grabbed his shredded clothes before heading back up to his room. He took a hot shower before climbing in bed. It was well after midnight, and he would be expected to attend tomorrow's festivities, whether he felt like it or not. "You think she's okay?" he asked Rafe as he lay there, already half asleep. "Yes. Go to sleep. I will monitor her throughout the night," Rafe replied calmly. "Wake me if anything changes." "Night, Rafe," Daniel muttered, and was out almost instantly. As the minutes ticked past midnight, Jenna sat reflecting back on the past year of her life. Her new love lay sleeping in her grandfather's arms not far from her mother as the family quietly welcomed the new year so as not to disturb the newest member. The last year had been one of the most amazing and most difficult of her life so far, but she wouldn't trade it. She had thought time would help ease the ache of losing Daniel, but her feelings for him had never receded. He was often in her thoughts and dreams, more than she ever cared to admit, even to herself. She could see bits of him every time she looked into her sweet Noelle's face. How she longed to tell him, to share her beautiful little girl with him. A pup, she smiled, remembering her shock when Talia had first told her that werewolves referred to their children as pups. She had thought at first that maybe they were born that way, as wolf pups, and Talia had found that hilarious. She'd laughed until her sides hurt and tears rolled down her cheeks. Jenna hadn't found it funny, though now she could see the humour in it. She had made herself a resolution that this year she would find a way to reconnect with Talia. She needed her friend badly. She'd been so worried and scared about the birth of her daughter. She had no idea what to expect, and as she could feel her labour progressing, she'd become more and more worried about what would happen. Werewolf births were not something Talia had mentioned, but then why would she? In her agitation, Jenna had kept the fact that she was in labour from her family as long as she could, but putting off the inevitable for as long as possible had resulted in her giving birth at home, which had scared her even more. What if her baby did come out as a wolf pup? She knew she was being ridiculous, but all the worst possible scenarios had ran rampant through her mind that day. But the moment Jenna had held Noelle in her arms, the world had righted again, and suddenly everything was okay. She smiled as she looked around at her family. They all had Noelle spoiled already. Only one piece of her heart was still missing, and Jenna was afraid it always would be. Over the next few weeks, Caroline seemed to do okay. She spent time with her children, her new grandbaby and her husband, enjoying each and every day with them. But then things started to go downhill. The aggressive cancer was spreading throughout her body, and Jenna watched her mother grow sicker and sicker by the day. The doctor was almost a daily visitor to their home. He asked Caroline if she wanted to go to the hospital, but she refused, telling him she would rather die at home. Jenna's father spent almost all of his waking moments with her. He'd do most of the talking, reminding her of important moments in their lives. Their wedding, the birth of each of their children, his return from each deployment, and the recent birth of their new grandbaby. She'd smile and listen, reminiscing with him over those precious memories. She wouldn't trade any of them for anything. One evening in early February, Caroline decided she wanted to go down to the lake and sit on the bench Mitch had built for her on the dock the previous summer. "Mama, it's too cold," Jenna protested. She'd just put Noelle down for a nap. Her mother gave her that look. Jenna glanced up at her father and he nodded. "All right, let me at least get you bundled up." 10 minutes later, Caroline was ready to brave the cold February evening. Mitch walked her over to the back door, where she stopped and turned back to Jenna. "Jenna, come here." Jenna stood up from her seat on the couch and approached her mother. Caroline placed a hand on her cheek. "Jenna, you're a wonderful mother." "I love you very much," she whispered softly. Jenna looked at her oddly. "I love you too, Mama." She watched them head outside and across the backyard before returning to her seat near the fireplace. Jenna's parents stayed out late. It was almost dark, and Jenna decided to walk out with a blanket for Caroline. She was worried her mother might get sick. She approached them quietly, almost hating to break up their time together, as she knew they wouldn't have much left. She slowed as she neared them. She could hear her father telling her mother about the first time he had seen her. His arm was wrapped around Caroline as her head rested on his shoulder. "Daddy," Jenna said cautiously, "I brought Mum a blanket. It's getting late, Jenna. Your mother is no longer active duty. She has retired," Mitch said gruffly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Jenna stared at her father for a moment as his words sank in. She stepped forward and laid the blanket over her mother, then turned back to the house. She wrapped her own arms around her body as sorrow swept through her. Her mamma was gone. Daniel sat at the conference table next to his sister. Outwardly, he seemed to be completely immersed in the conversation going on, but inwardly he had tuned it all out a while ago. Not that he was the least bit worried. Charity was an expert negotiator, lie detector, and was a natural at smoothing things over. She had a calming aura surrounding her and could ease a furious alpha very easily. Daniel still couldn't believe it had been almost a year since he'd last seen Jenna. She'd seemed happier the last several weeks, but the sadness was always still there, and now seemed worse than it had been before Christmas. A wave of overwhelming sadness suddenly hit Daniel so hard he felt like someone had punched him in the gut. He jumped up immediately, startling both his sister and their guests. "Excuse me," he barely muttered before quickly exiting the conference room. Charity watched her brother leave the office in exasperation. Why now? Daniel had been acting so strange for the last several months. What was his problem? Is something wrong? Charity turned back to Alpha Jason Connolly of the Virginia Pack and smiled. Not at all. The Alpha just has an important call he needs to take. More important than me, Alpha Jason glared at her. Arrogant weasel, Solara, Charity's wolf muttered in disgust. Charity couldn't agree more. But sometimes you have to deal with people you don't like. I'm the one who is in charge of this situation, Charity reminded him. But I came to see the Alpha King. Jason folded his arms across the table, his eyes on the door. Not a little girl. Is he incapable of doing his job? Let me kill him, Solara growled. Alpha Jason, any complaints you have about the rogue pack will come back to me, no matter who you speak to. So why go to a middleman when you can come directly to the source? Charity flashed him a brilliant smile. Jason's gaze returned to her, and she watched in disgust as it flicked down over her before returning to her face. She really disliked the Alpha. He was only 22 and as arrogant as the day was long. He was also ruthless and not to be trusted. Not that she was worried in the least, but he still made her skin crawl. I think we should continue this discussion when the Alpha King is available, he said, giving her a smirk. Charity nodded. She would get nowhere with him as long as Daniel wasn't in the room. That's fine. We can meet again tomorrow after breakfast, she said, keeping her calm, though she wanted to throttle him. I'll show you to the guest quarters, Alpha. The Alpha nodded and stood, then followed Charity out of the conference room and down the hall. She stopped in front of a small apartment and unlocked the door before turning to him. Breakfast is at 9 sharp. The dining hall is in the right wing, past the main entrance. She handed him the key to the room. His hand came up and cupped her cheek. Charity froze, staring into his eyes. Would you care to join me? Arrogant weasel, Solara growled. Oh, Alpha, thank you for the invitation, but I'm saving myself for my fated mate. Charity batted her lashes at him. His eyes narrowed as he tried to stare her down, but she refused to drop her gaze. If Alpha Jason thought he could intimidate her, he had another thing coming. His thumb traced her bottom lip before his hand slid down and around her neck, and he pushed her into his room. Charity grabbed hold of his arm and tried to pull it from her neck. Jason shoved her against the wall and buried his face in her neck. She felt his canines graze her marking spot, and her fury came out full force. Unhand me now, Charity demanded. Jason pulled back and smirked at her. He cupped her breast with his other hand, never loosening the grip on her neck. I'll make you a deal, princess. Come back to my pack with me. Agree to be my Luna, and let me breed my pups on you, and I'll drop this whole thing, and I'll drop this whole thing and let you have your precious little rogue pack. He tightened his grip on both her breast and her neck, cutting off her air. He watched her face, excited to see her panic, but to his shock she remained completely calm, never dropping her gaze from him, which made him angry. Who did this, she? Who thinks she was? He was an Alpha, and she would bow to him. He raised his hand up to slap her, but to his surprise she caught it before he could, stopping him. His hand tightened even more around her neck, and she suddenly grabbed his balls, squeezing them until he winced and loosened his grip. As I said before, Alpha, I am saving myself for my fated mate. Now unhand me, or I will put you down. Her eyes flashed blue, and she growled in warning, her hand gripping his family jewels a bit tighter. Jason gave a strangled laugh as he suddenly let her go. You think you could take me? You do know I've already put down 6 challenges to my title, right? I could easily kill you, little Charity, but I'd much rather bed you. He opened the door back out to the hallway and stood there waiting for her to leave. Let me kill him, Solara shouted. Charity gave the Alpha a small smile as she walked past him. Thank you for the kind offer, Alpha, but I must decline. As I believe I have mentioned before, I'm saving myself for my fated mate. Then I believe our business here is concluded. Princess? She stopped in her tracks and turned around to look at him. The arrogant weasel stood in the doorway, muscle arms folded, as he leaned against the frame and gave her a smug smile. I will be taking my leave in the morning. Don't worry about the meeting. He stepped back into his room and slammed the door in her face.